So we should just start introducing ourselves?
I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You go first.
Hello, I'm Paula Overby. I'm a candidate for the U.S. Senate in Minnesota. Thank you.
My name is Dani. I'm a transgender Native American artist, and I live in Minneapolis.
Welcome.
So how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm feeling a little bit of anxiety. I
Yeah,
think
I'm
like
sure.
most Americans are today, there's a lot of
Yes.
uncertainty about the future here.
Mm-hmm.
A lot going on, but it is a beautiful sunny day.
Absolutely. And it's Sunday. It's what day is it with the riots? Was it day 5?
Oh, it must be day 5, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So what's your impression on what's going on right now?
Well, first of all, we had the pandemic, right?
Absolutely.
So
That's one layer of it.
That's one layer, yes. And it's like we've almost forgotten about the pandemic. Right now,
Honestly, I forgot about the pandemic. I totally forgot what was going on.
Forgot about it, yes. Then right now it's about the death of George Floyd, and a very, very graphic video of how that happened.
Absolutely. What was your first reaction when you seen that video?
It's very hard to watch. It's very visceral. It's very emotionally intense. You just see how dehumanizing it is. It's long. So you see this police officer with his knee on the neck of George Floyd. George Floyd is pleading for his life. I can't
Absolutely.
breathe. There's bystanders there that are also pleading for his life. Let him go, man. He can't breathe. There's another officer that's blocking the path of bystanders. Yeah, very emotional. Very
Right.
hard to watch.
I mean, the officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes.
9 minutes,
You
I
know.
guess, was the total count. Yeah,
And being
it's-
being pressed against the pavement, and not being able to breathe, and then begging for his life. It's a really graphic video, and it's heart-wrenching to watch.
And the response of our political leadership is frustrating as well. Initially the police reported that he died of a medical complication. I guess not being able to breathe would be a medical complication. And there's a lot of focus on the idea of one bad actor, a lot of focus on the police officer. But I'm looking at 4 police officers that felt this was an appropriate way to treat a suspect, a possible suspect, in forgery of a $20 bill.
Right.
So right away, it's a much broader issue than one bad actor.
And as much as this is like seeing that video, it's really hard to defend the cops, because you see how graphic and how aggressive they can be. And but people will try to defend these cops, and you're hearing that storyline play out, especially on social media.
Well, I mean, that's basically the history of racism in America. It's, dehumanize people, depict them as criminals, criminalize their behavior, put them in prison. 40% of our prison population is African American.
Absolutely. The modern day slavery, right?
They are working for corporations. There is that element of it as well, modern day slavery. Even now, it's quite emotional talking about it.
Right. But watching the video in its entirety, like I had a very emotional reaction when I first seen it. I was angry. I was deeply saddened. But one of the most what I noticed that infuriated me was that this cop, the look on his face, as when he has his knee on George Floyd's neck, and he just kind of is looking at people videoing him, and it's like another day to him. He has absolutely, there's no remorse in his face, or he honestly does not believe that he's doing something wrong.
Yeah. He feels totally justified. He knows he's on camera. That's one of the things people are discussing is white racism in our police departments. The discussion about policing has been going on for a long time. George Floyd is not the first black man that's been killed in Minneapolis. A couple of the other high visibility cases that I was involved with in the aftermath was Leonard Castile over in St. Paul, Blevin Thurmans up in North Minneapolis, shot in the back, running away from police officers. No charges in any of those cases.
And I can understand the reaction and the anger, the protests, to some extent even the riots. We're just tired of this happening over and over and over again. And this one incident, it's very infuriating, but also, remember Sandra Bland? That to me was one of the most infuriating things. Talk about escalation from a simple traffic violation to all of a sudden a person getting arrested and then leading to suicide. How can we jump from this all the way to that?
So true, yeah. And it's, I think one of the things I've talked about recently is some of my own history. I took criminal justice studies in college back in the 70s. I recall studying the LA Watts riots in 65. There were a lot of major urban riots in the 60s. I feel like nothing's changed.
Yeah.
We passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and we're still dealing with enormous racial inequity in this society.
Right. I mean, I'm hoping that it's going to change, because the one thing that we have now that we didn't have back then is that everybody's equipped with these cameras. Everyone can pull out their phone and start recording, and that's what we're seeing is everything that we're seeing now, it's been happening for a long time. And the only difference is now people are recording it and getting proof and posting it online.
That's a good point. And I like that concept. I like that idea. I've long been a defender of the idea that the First Amendment protects the Second, right? Gun enthusiasts like to put that the other way around. But I'm also concerned by the fact that how quickly major media, government representatives move to change the narrative, right? So the narrative that we're hearing right now isn't really about racism or racial inequality or economic injustice. The narrative we're hearing is still this narrative of bad actors.
Right.
That if we can bring in, Governor Walz has assembled the largest military force that's ever been assembled in Minnesota. I hope that's not going to be a legacy of his career or a feather in his cap. But how are we using that police force, right? Not to protect citizens, not to protect property, not to protect peaceful protesters. We're using that police force to eliminate bad actors, right? Yesterday we were hearing that everybody arrested was from out of state. Today we're hearing that wasn't quite true. But what it shows us is that the government, our representatives, our governor, the mayor of Minneapolis, are trying to create this narrative, right, of external forces, bad actors. It's not Minnesotans. It's not a problem with Minnesota. It's not a problem with racial inequity or social injustice. Minnesota actually has some of the worst wealth inequality in the nation.
And it's very segregated here too. Very segregated here.
We still have significant problems with the education gap, or the school to prison pipeline. Very well documented in Minnesota. the spotlight is on Minnesota, right?
Right.
And Governor Walz is quite aware of that, right? And he's trying to take the spotlight off of Minnesota because we don't want to expose those issues. And we need to expose those issues, and we need to address those issues. It's been hundreds of years. We see the impact that keeps rising every so often. We had the Rodney King riots in LA again in 1992. Now it is 60 years later since the Civil Rights Act was, and we're still seeing this kind of violence.
I mean, what I want to see happen, the media needs to take responsibility for what they're putting out. Do not lead with these like catchy titles, the drama. Lead with the shocking part of the news, and how much of that is actually factual, and lead with give people the facts, give people the information, and don't try to stir the pot. Like that's what we keep hearing, and it feels very divisive because it always has to turn into an us versus them thing, of Minnesotans versus people who are outside of Minnesota, pro police, anti-police, pro Black Lives Matter, and it's just too much. It's like like I said, this is to me it's a very like straightforward incident that occurred, and we shouldn't have to take sides on it, and we just want to see justice. So what justice do you think needs to happen?
But I think, if you're part of the African American community, you want to see more than justice for George Floyd. That's the focus right now. That's the spark that ignited the fire. But the fire is still burning, literally burning, yes. Right? How do you put the fire out? We can prosecute the police officer responsible for the death of George Floyd. Possibly they will prosecute the remaining 3 officers that were also responsible.
Right.
But it doesn't address the underlying problem.
Yeah.
What are we going to do about all these businesses that have been totally destroyed by this violence? Is there going to be economic assistance? Are we going to rebuild these communities? That's the long-range solution, right?
I mean, it definitely brings to light a lot of things that have been brewing forever.
And, yeah.
It's like and there's more to consider. Like how do you fix racial inequality in America? And what can you do, because it seems like everyone has a different definition of what justice is and what should be carried out at this point. And like you said, like being Black, you want more, you deserve more,
Yeah, basic humanity, perhaps. Basic equality, a fair opportunity. Those are not major things to be asking for.
Right. And what are Black people expecting white people
to
do at this point? Like,
we need to. I'm running for the United States Senate. I've been an anti-war activist since the Vietnam War. I oppose the vast resources we put into military spending, and I oppose the militarization of our police, which is part of this issue that we're dealing with in Minneapolis today. But we do need a major shift in priorities. We spend over 60% of our budget on war. We deliver all of our military surplus to police departments. We are the global bad actors, right? We are the largest exporters of weapons around the globe. And so that's the higher level that I aspire to. I believe we need reform in our political process. What alternative do the protesters have? What's their political course of action? There isn't one. We basically have one party in Minnesota. a party that I belong to, by the way, a party that I think is in the process of reform and needs reform. But those are the broader issues, the more long-range issues. I think the immediate issue right now is similar to what was required for the pandemic. You can't allow people to be homeless and starving to death.
We kind of touched on this a little bit about what people are comfortable talking about, but the things that they're not talking about is the part of this whole conversation that people need to hear. You know, is race. You know, discussing race. Something that Minnesotans are not very good at.
People are, and it's not a core part of the discussion.
Do you think being white, is it, do you feel comfortable talking about race, especially with people of color like myself?
You know, I'm certainly not comfortable talking for other people. And I'm certainly not comfortable with tokenizing people, right? The black community is a diverse community, right? More diverse than it's ever been, right? It isn't just African American; it's also recent immigrants, Somalis, Muslims.
And we're starting to see like their voting power.
Yes, and it's a growing population, and some of the white community is probably a little alarmed by that as well. The world has changed, and the world is changing.
Absolutely.
And that's the part we need to accept, I think. How do we adapt to those changes? I don't think we can go back to the 50s or the 60s. And I don't know that that's such a great idea either. We had a lot of riots in the 60s.
Right.
We had a major war going on in the 60s. You know, I'm very comfortable talking about race, but I'm always a little bit uncertain about what that conversation should look like. I have a friend, he's black, and he talks about allophilia.
What is that?
That's having a positive attitude towards a group that is not your own.
Oh, I see.
So it's a step beyond acceptance, right? And I really like the concept. You know, I have worked with him recently on creating a multicultural center over on the east side, and we're very excited about that. But I'd like to ask you the same. How do you? What has been your experience with racism? How do you feel about talking about racism and your own personal experiences as a person of color?
Well, I think when you grow up in a brown household, you just have a different perspective on the whole thing. You know, you're kind of taught how to talk about race by your parents because they talk about it a lot, and usually it's kind of more of in a negative way about how you as a brown person or as a black person, how you are supposed to conduct yourself around white people. I mean, that's something that I heard growing up a lot. Is, you know, if you ever get pulled over by the cops, then don't look guilty.
Don't look guilty. Yes,
don't look guilty.
Yeah,
it's don't look guilty. It's like don't do anything that could just slightly aggravate the white person in authority. And I mean,
don't reach for your wallet.
Absolutely.
Right?
And we can we see all the time about how, you know, these little instances of a traffic violation can turn into something way more extreme and dramatic. So you already mentioned before about moving beyond tolerance, and certainly all lives matter is not the answer. We sometimes hear about trans lives matter and Native lives matter. So what's your opinion on that?
Well, first of all, you know, I think that racism was originally constructed to create the middle class that very much isolates and protects the ruling class. If anybody's more interested in that topic, I would recommend a podcast that I listen to called Seen White.
Okay. That's an interesting title. What does that mean?
It's about the history of racism. It's about the history of slavery. It's about the manner in which racism was constructed in this country, beginning even before the Revolutionary War in 1776.
Yeah.
I strongly recommend it. It's it's a good foundation for understanding racism, how it was constructed, and perhaps how we can deconstruct it.
Because it sounds like by that title, Seen White, that it kind of sounds like in order for you to see racism, you also have to see white people and how they're treated. So it's kind of like seeing the reverse in order to understand people who are not white.
I would say that's true. And I think that's very much the focus of a lot of discussion about racism, is understanding your own whiteness, understanding your own privilege. And even today, we talked about this earlier, the potential change in those privileges, right? Which is, I think, something that a lot of young people are struggling with today.
Right.
From that perspective, I tend to think about racism and talk about racism in terms of ending violence, which is certainly something that a lot of people want, right?
Right.
And I think that perspective then has a broad appeal, right? I'm looking at how do we bring people together, how do we create unity, how do we create change.
So in regards to what's going on right now, certainly the peaceful protesters are not the ones responsible for the violence. So who is responsible for the violence?
Well, I think that takes us back to what I was discussing earlier about this narrative of bad actors. I think that's a totally false narrative, and the African American community is all too well aware of that. And we could look at some other examples. When you said earlier that you were a person of color, my thoughts immediately jumped to Standing Rock.
Yes.
Because I know that you have an indigenous heritage.
Yes, the Dakota Pipeline. So, talking about Standing Rock, what was your reaction to it? Were you there?
No, I wasn't there. The Standing Rock movement was really a spiritual celebration almost, celebrating our resources, our earth, our air, our water. It was about protecting water.
Water is life, yeah.
Water is life. So that's what they were asking for. I didn't really feel I had the resources to participate at that time, as much as I wanted to be there and experience that. But my overall reaction to it was how it ended.
Right.
When they decided they wanted to move forward with the pipeline, when the ruling elites decided that they wanted that land and they wanted that oil, it ended in violence.
Yes.
They went in and they took it.
Yes.
Which is the history of the indigenous population.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, talk about a civil rights issue of our time.
Right.
Well, thank you for sharing about that.
So the indigenous populations and the African American populations have very different histories, right?
Yes.
And yet there is a common element. And I think that's part of what I strive for, is to find that common element and create that unity and identify the sources of change.
That's very respectable. So Paula, I know it's a focus of your campaign, anti-war. Why the focus on violence?
Well, it goes back to the anti-war movement back in the 60s, the Vietnam War. Even before that, in the early 60s, there were a lot of urban riots. I was 14 years old when Martin Luther King was shot. I remember well the peace protest at the Democratic National Convention in 1968. And that was not a racial protest, right? That was mostly white people protesting the Vietnam War. They were in a park a good 10 or 12 miles from the convention center. And again, the establishment, the ruling elite,
Yes.
however you want to define that, was supporting the Vietnam War. And they were opposing the peace movement. And that demonstration ended in violence as well. And the National Coalition on Causes and Prevention of Violence ruled it a police riot. So the police attacked the protesters. This is a repeating story we see across the board, right?
History repeating itself.
History repeating itself. So it isn't just black culture, it's indigenous culture, it's peace protesters, it's anyone that's opposing the establishment narrative.
So that's the reason for the focus on violence.
And exactly.
Well, I'm glad you're campaigning on
it. And it also draws those things together, right? So it associates the violence in this country with our foreign policy and our military policy. And that's the reason for my strong anti-war platform.
That's great. So another question. So do you see a difference between what's happening today and, what you were just describing back then?
I see. Well, one thing that you referenced earlier was the cell phones, right?
Yes.
And the ability to expose this violence. That's a good thing. But the other thing I see that is a very important difference, and I think an important distinction moving forward, is how multicultural these demonstrations are.
Yes.
That gives me hope. That leads me to believe that we definitely are establishing a more unified population.
Yes, we have to support each other.
That we are building community that's multiracial.
Yes.
That's ethnically diverse. And that's an important step.
Yes, and we can't end violence with more violence.
I love that concept. In fact, I wish I'd said that. Violence is something that affects everyone in America. And people are tired of the violence.
Yes.
Think of all of the school shootings, the mass shootings, school shootings that predominantly affect white children, right? So it isn't simply just a racial issue. I think if we want to end violence in America, we need a major shift in priorities.
Yes, we do.
And a lot of it does center around the militarization of our society, our foreign policy, our foreign imperialist policy. Nobody likes to see tanks rolling down the streets of Main Street America.
Yes, and it kind of feels like it's being normalized now.
Exactly. And that's a very bad direction, and we need to turn that around. And that's why I focus so strongly on anti-war policy.
Yes, I'm glad you do.
Those of us that are opposed to violence, and most of us are, need to start working together.
Yes, we do.
So this is an ongoing discussion. If you want to follow this discussion, be sure to click the subscribe button.
Yes.
Dani, did you want to tell us where we can find you on Instagram?
Yeah, you can find me.
social media?
You can find my art on Instagram. Just search my full name, Dani May Austin, Dani May like the month, and Austin like Austin, Texas. And you can find me on Facebook at Art by Dani May.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So Paula, any final thoughts on George Floyd?
Well, I mean, certainly my heart goes out to his family, to his friends, to his community. This is a very difficult time. It's a difficult time to think about long-term solutions and long range. But we want to look towards real change as well.